Okay, we ready to roll? That Italian food is sitting very heavy on me right now. I feel very relaxed up here. That was good though, it was good. Okay, let's continue on with our systematic dismantling of evolution. We'll start looking now at the fifth plank out of our 7 on the list. And we want to specifically look at some of the specific evidences that are given for Darwinian evolution. So if evolution, remember, can be shown to be implausible, then logically you've got to have some form of creation. But in order for something to for an idea to even claim to be scientific and rational, then it has to have scientific evidence in support of it. And evolutionists believe that they have that evidence in support of their theory that we want to start looking at in this session. We already specifically looked at some of the specific evidences for the Big Bang, but we want to look at Darwinian evolution now as well. And these are the implications of the 6 sets of laws that we looked at in our previous 4 sessions. And what we found is that the laws of science stand as testaments against naturalistic evolution. But again, for a theory to be scientific, it needs evidence, and they believe they have that. So if you were to ask a Darwinian evolutionist, where is the proof for Darwinian evolution? You're probably going to hear a discussion of some or all of these alleged proofs of evolution. So young people, your biology textbooks are going to typically have several pages devoted to this alleged evidence for evolutionary theory. But really, as we wade through these evidences, we'll find that each of them falls into one of these 3 categories. Either erroneous evidence, that is, they've been proven to be false already, even by evolutionists, and it just hasn't been taken out of the textbooks. Or irrelevant evidence, that is, they don't really have anything to do with Darwinian evolution at all, but instead microevolution, which we don't even argue with. Or they're inadequate, that is, they could support evolution, but they're not sufficient evidence to prove evolution, because the same evidence could be used in support of creation. So let's wade through this alleged evidence and see if it passes the science test. Charles Darwin, remember, in his travels, noted that animals were slightly different from one another, but clearly still related, would sometimes be found in a single local area, but in different habitats, like different climates. And he saw this as evidence that those animals evolved from a common ancestor in the area. We already looked at one of the primary evidences that he pointed to, and that was the finches of the Galapagos. But he saw the same pattern with various tortoises and iguanas and plants. And recall that we noted that the finches that were slightly different from each other were still acknowledged to be finches. And the changes that occurred in them was due to, remember, heritable variation. So variation that was already in the species that was able to be passed on. So inherited traits. So nothing new was added. That genetic information was already had to be in the genome. So the question is, where does that information come from? Macroevolution had not been shown to occur with those examples. He also acknowledged cases where there were animals in similar habitats across the world, and yet these animals looked very similar, but apparently not related. Okay, even though they had similarities in structure. And he considered this to be evidence of natural selection, that the presence of particular environmental pressures in different places would force certain body characteristics to thrive in various environments, even though those creatures aren't actually related. So, and then others less suited to that environment, again, are going to tend to die out according to natural selection. Again, this is just evidence of natural selection, which again doesn't prove that we evolved from a single-celled organism. Don't have a problem with natural selection. It's just a filtering mechanism. It doesn't tell you how you get the creatures that are then filtered. Ernst Haeckel was a German biologist and avid supporter of Charles Darwin, and he popularized the theory now known as embryonic recapitulation. And he drew charts like this one on the screen here. Embryonic recapitulation, called the biogenetic law by Haeckel. This is not the law of biogenesis. This is the biogenetic law. This is the idea that as creatures are developing in the womb, they repeat the evolutionary development of their species. So if you want to know what your evolutionary ancestors look like, you would look at embryos as they're developing in the womb. So for instance, according to his ideas, human embryos are developing. They go through stages where they look like various animals, supposedly in our evolutionary timeline, fish and so forth. And so he argued there's a period of time where human embryos are basically fish. They've got gills represented in red on the PowerPoint and tails like our supposed evolutionary ancestors. And so Haeckel drew these various species in different phases of their embryological development, put them side by side to try to bolster the case for evolution. So embryonic recapitulation is still taught in many biology textbooks today using the catchphrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. The problem is that this was shown to be false decades ago. So notice, for example, what the famous influential paleontologists of Columbia University, George Gaylord Simpson and William Beck, wrote. The human embryo does not have any differentiated gill tissue, and the gill-like pouches do not have open gill slits as in fishes. Fins are lacking. The tail is not at all like any fish's tail. Indeed, the resemblance to an adult fish is vague and superficial. It just kind of vaguely kind of looks like it, but it actually has nothing. It's not a fish. It's not our an ancestor or something. So bottom line, as they went on to say, it is now firmly established that ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny. So according to leading evolutionists, Haeckel was wrong about that. Embryos don't mimic Darwinian evolution as they grow in the womb. Erich Blechschmidt was a prominent German embryologist and anatomist. The Blechschmidt Collection and Museum at the University of Göttingen was named after this guy. He didn't pull any punches in his criticism of Haeckel's theory. The so-called basic law of biogenetics is wrong. No buts or ifs can mitigate this fact. It's not even a tiny bit correct or correct in a different form. It is totally wrong. Well, if that's true, then what do we do with these diagrams? Bottom line, the material that they display is actually fake. It's a hoax, misrepresentations, even lies. Haeckel not only altered his illustrations of embryos to support his theory, he even in some cases printed the same plate of an embryo 3 times and then labeled one of them a human, one a dog, the third a rabbit in order to try to prove their similarities. So he perpetuated this hoax, and again, even the evolutionists acknowledge that. Miller and Levine, in their textbook, notice what they say. Ernst Haeckel fudged some of his drawings to make the earliest stages of some embryos seem more similar than they actually are. And sadly, in spite of these kind of admissions, many biology textbooks still use embryonic recapitulation as proof of evolution. In fact, this statement is in the section of that book titled Evidence of Evolution. So they continue to keep that in there. Regarding Haeckel's embryos, Professor of Zoology at the University of Manchester, Matthew Cobb, writing in New Scientist, said, "It's embarrassing but true. Some of the most influential drawings in the history of biology," again talking about Haeckel's, "are wrong, exaggerated to fit a thesis." What about homologous structures? What's this argument about? Evolutionists argue that many vertebrate species, backbone species, have structures that are constructed from the same basic bones and therefore very similar. And because of that similarity, they argue, as does this textbook, Homologous structures provide strong evidence that all four-limbed vertebrates have descended with modifications from common ancestors, right? So they argue for this for evolution. So similar looking anatomical structures, according to evolutionists, are strong evidence that we share common ancestry with whales and frogs. Darwin himself saw homology as a strong point in support of his theory. He said, "We have seen that the members of the same class, independently of their habits of life, resemble each other in the general plan of their organization. Is it not powerfully suggestive of true relationship, of inheritance from a common ancestor?" So is this true? After all, aren't our similarities to our siblings and parents proof of our relation to them? Well, first of all, it's important to realize creationists don't deny that similarities do exist in many cases in different structures. We don't deny the evidence. There's no need to. It's always going to be in harmony with the truth. The problem isn't the evidence, it is the interpretation of that evidence by evolutionists. The evolutionist says that these similarities prove a common ancestor. We would say that these commonalities prove a common designer. So consider, for example, the automobile industry. Many GMC vehicles, for example, will use the same tires, the same brake systems, windshield wipers, light bulbs, and even have very similar body shapes in some case with each other. Why is that? Well, because they evolved from each other. They came to life and morphed into another car. No, it has nothing to do with that. Their similarities exist because they were designed by the same company. They share a common designer. And those vehicles, notice, were all designed to drive on similar roads and freeways, to use the same fuel, and to have the same mechanics. And so in the same way that God designed the lung to be suitable for life on earth with an atmosphere like ours, we would expect a very similar design to be used in other beings that are going to be breathing the same air that we are, and living in the same relative environment. So in truth, when examined closely, the homology argument quickly starts to break down and you start to see inconsistencies. So for example, humans share very similar analogous structures with several creatures that would not be argued to be relations of ours. Like, for example, we share similarities with the octopus eye, the pig heart, the Pekingese dog's face, the milk of a donkey, and the pronator quadratus muscle of the Japanese salamander. But evolutionists would hardly deem these creatures to be relations of ours in the way that they would say apes. Even certain plants in the crustacean Daphnia have hemoglobin, as do humans, so are they to be considered close relations of man? Also keep in mind that evolutionists admit that similar structures don't always mean common ancestry. Because as I mentioned a few moments ago, they believe environmental pressures can cause certain features to show up separate and apart from ancestry. And another inconsistency, if similarity proves common ancestry, then what would dissimilarity prove? There are more dissimilarities between humans and other animals than there are similarities. So the homology argument only works when you pick and choose. So in truth, it makes more sense that there was a common designer for these creatures that use certain structural features several times in many different creatures due to the fact that those anatomical structures are ideal for life on this planet. And so you've got a common engineer, he's going to use these same effective designs in different creatures. So this argument can hardly be used as evidence for evolution when structural similarities can easily be interpreted in another way. So this would be an example of an inadequate evidence for evolution. What about genetic similarities? Haven't scientists discovered that human DNA is like 98 to 99% identical to chimpanzee DNA? And on the surface, sounds like a pretty strong argument that we evolved from these ape-like creatures and for their close relation, and it's been argued as such for years. when you look deeper into this and think about this, you find it can be extremely misleading to make this argument. First of all, further research into the genome has caused that number to plummet over the years, and jump from 98.5 down to 95. It's continuing to drop. I'll talk about that in a little bit. First of all, because of X and Y chromosomes, men are actually closer genetically to male chimpanzees than they are to human females. It's genetics matches male chimps, the males, more closely than they would match the females. Does that really make human males closer to chimpanzees than women? Maybe. No, it doesn't. That's a silly analogy to try to make. Although you may look at the behavior of men and then think that sometimes. Jonathan Marks, who's an evolutionary anthropologist and geneticist, he was a professor at Yale for several years, as well as UC Berkeley. He's now a professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, last time I checked. But he talks extensively about the dangers of misinterpreting this supposed genetic evidence and reading too much into the DNA similarities between chimps and humans. He wrote this book called What It Means to Be 98% Chimpanzee. And he discusses the misleading tendency to compare these long chains of genetic subunits in DNA. He said the comparison can also be misleading in two important ways. First, such comparisons of DNA sequence ignore qualitative differences, those of kind rather than amount. So if you're looking at the sequence of DNA, you've got A, G, C, or T, and you're looking at just the way that they line up. Is it A, G, G, T, C, or A, G, T, C, C? If you're just looking at the number, that gives you one perspective, but it's not looking at necessarily what qualitative differences, then as opposed to just the quantitative. The second misleading area of DNA sequence comparisons entails a consideration of the other end of the scale. He explains that because DNA is a linear array of these four bases, A, G, C, and T, only four possibilities exist at any specific point in a DNA sequence. The laws of chance tell us that two random sequences from species that have no ancestry in common will still match at about 1 in every 4 sites. Sorry, for some reason this is hanging off the edge here. Thus, even two unrelated DNA sequences will be 25% identical, not 0% identical. That makes sense to you? So in other words, because at any given point in the DNA, you've only got 4 choices, even two totally unrelated genomes are still going to appear to be 25% identical because there's only 4 possibilities at each point, and even just chance would say they're going to end up lining up at least 25% of the time. So the DNA of a human and any other creature that has DNA is still going to be 25% identical. In other words, it'd be interpreted by them as we're 25% related to any other creature. So using that comparison, a daffodil is genetically 25% human because it's got DNA. And according to Marx, its sequence is going to match humans at least 25% of the time. Do you think a daffodil is 25% human? I don't think so. That's not a very good comparison. Genetic comparisons like this aren't accurate comparisons. Now, that said, certain genetic similarities would be completely expected given that you have similar body structures, physiologies, biochemistries, intended diets, given that certain living organisms are designed, again, for life in a similar environment, similar habitats, and ultimately given the same designer. Humans and chimps are both mammals and have very similar types of internal organs because of the environments God created us to live in. We both eat fruits and vegetables, which means our mouths and digestive systems are going to have similar characteristics. We both have eyes, ears, noses, mouths, fingers, and we get sensory information from all these body structures. So there's no doubt that there are going to be many similarities between human and chimp DNA, but you can't jump from A to Z and draw conclusions not warranted by the evidence and claim, therefore, we evolved from an ape. Similarities exist and would be expected if we share a common designer, and once again, that perspective is in complete harmony with the creation model. But if a person contends that genetic similarities prove that we evolved from a common ancestor, then problems and inconsistencies abound, as we've looked at here briefly. So the evolutionary model, not in harmony with the evidence. It's not reasonable, the reasonable scientific choice. Instead, it is the closed-minded, biased choice, as we've shown in these previous sessions. Now, all that said, consider a couple different things. Number one, geneticist Jeffrey Tompkins dug into the comparisons that have been reported all these years and discovered that in previous human-chimp DNA comparisons, researchers have not been accounting for unaligned regions of the compared genomes. And they failed to account for human DNA contamination that is common in this sequencing. So he found that accounting for these issues, the human and chimp DNA similarity drops to about 84%, not 98 to 99%. This was a few years ago. And amazingly, very hot off the presses in the last few weeks. Even the secular community has now come out and acknowledged, oh, whoops, we're actually only 85% similar to the chimpanzees in our DNA. So they apparently have found some of the things that creation scientists have been pointing out for about the last decade. What about horse evolution? Hasn't that been documented in the fossil record? It has been taught as such in biology textbooks for decades. Supposedly the modern horse, called Equus, has been documented as having evolved from the small fox-like creature known as Hyracotherium or Eohippus. And so biology textbooks will say things like this one: in spite of the missing pieces, paleontologists can offer a relatively clear picture of the evolution of many organisms. One example is the series of fossils that shows the development of the modern horse over 50 million years. The authors then proceed to show the standard horse evolution diagram, showing the alleged evolution of modern horse from Hyracotherium, claiming the first horse was actually quite small, about the size of a small dog. This illustration shows the first horse as well as several of the intermediate ancestors of today's horse. 2006 edition continued to promote this idea. On page 439, the authors used the standard classic pictures of horse evolution to illustrate the nature of evolution by gradualism, which is Darwinian thinking. John Rennie, writing in Scientific American in 2002, he said, actually, paleontologists know of many detailed examples of fossils intermediate in form between various taxonomic groups. The sequence of fossils spans the evolution of modern horses from the tiny Eohippus. So evolutionists have used horse evolution charts as decisive evidence of evolution. Now the problem is that the leading evolutionists themselves, the ones in the know, long ago abandoned horse evolution as a good example of transitional forms. David Raup of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, he admitted decades ago, we're now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. What appeared to be a nice, simple progression when relatively few data were available now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic, much less Darwinian, in other words. So we don't have the evidence for transitional creatures linking various kinds in the fossil record. You need that if evolution is true, but it's not there. The famous paleontologist of Harvard that I've quoted several times today, back in 1953, summed it up, and he said, the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. So all that said, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. This chart doesn't prove that a fox-like creature can turn into a horse, but that's not to say that paleontologists may not have gotten some of this right. We wouldn't expect the horse today to look exactly like the horses that were on the ark. So the horse kind that was represented on the ark would have looked different than today's horses. perhaps more like one of these other representatives that are shown on this chart. But notice it would still be of the horse kind, with only variations occurring within that single group. This is not evolution outside of the horse kind, which is what Darwinian evolution is arguing for. Well, some evolutionists proceed to counter with, well, who cares about horse evolution, because whale evolution is well documented. So they'll jump to this one. One Science Daily article titled, "Whales Descended from Tiny Deer-like Creatures" said, whale evolution is one of the best documented examples of mammal evolution. All right, so this is one of the best ones. You want to go to the source to prove evolution. Here it is, whale evolution. And supposedly in this well-documented story, whales evolved from mammals that lived on land. Okay, so the story of evolution is interesting because they argue that life started in the oceans and then they evolved onto land, and then apparently the whales evolved from land creatures that go back into the ocean. That's a whole interesting thing too. But these mammals on land supposedly gradually moved to the water in search of food, fish and water prey, for example. In a 2007 edition of Nature, J.G.M. Thewison, who's an evolutionary anatomist and a professor at Northeast Ohio Medical University, he claimed that he has found the oldest, closest relative of the whale. Now here's the problem. For many years, again in this apparently, supposedly well-documented story of the evolution of whales, the hippopotamus was considered to be the closest whale relative. Now, if that's the case, then there's no way that whale evolution is well documented, as they're claiming, because Thewison is now claiming the evolutionary community needs to totally change their entire theory about whale evolution. Supposedly, Indohyus, a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of the raccoon, should now be considered the closest relative of the whale, a creature that looks like the African mouse deer. All right, now, if whale evolution is so well documented as they claim, then how can you make a major switch like this at the drop of a hat, as though this isn't a big deal? Changing from the hippo as the closest ancestor to a small, stocky artiodactyl, roughly the size of a raccoon? This apparently is not as well documented as they have claimed, if they can make that kind of a change. Well, again, in this supposedly well-documented story, whales evolved from land-dwelling mammals that moved into water in search of water-dwelling prey. And again, Thewison says we need to totally turn that up on its head. According to Thewison, mammals that gradually moved into the water in search of prey apparently were not carnivores, as has always been thought. Clearly, this is not the case. Indohyus is a plant eater and already is aquatic. Apparently the dietary shift to hunting animals, as modern whales do, came later than the habitat shift to the water. Okay, so with the discovery of one deer-like fossil, the whole alleged evolution of whales is swept aside, okay, and we're switching from carnivore to herbivore, and instead of land, it's already a water-dwelling creature. Whales didn't evolve from the land-dwelling ancestors in search of food. So what in the world is happening that would link Indohyus to the whale, that would make them want to switch all this all of a sudden? What's so significant about this find that makes him want to change this? According to scientists, although Indohyus, as it is known, looks nothing like the whales of today, yeah, it shares certain anatomical features. Right? So we're back to homologous structures again. There's some similarities in structure between the two, right? Which means, you know, even though this creature doesn't look like the whale, it has certain things that are similar. So if you see similarity, then there's got to be relation, no matter how intuitively silly the idea is. Now, logically, doesn't the whale share anatomical features with other creatures that you would think would make better sense as potential relations? What makes the Indohyus special? Well, exactly. Thewison actually admits these anatomical features are in fact shared with other creatures. He says all of these characters are found in some mammals unrelated to cetaceans, to the whale. So what's so special about Indohyus? Well, the distinguishing feature of the Indohyus appears to be its teeth. which are suggested to be similar to whales' teeth. So the entire evolutionary shift is based on that idea. All right, now here's the problem with this idea. Indohyus is a confessed herbivore. In the teeth of whales, whales are confessed carnivores. All right, now they ridicule creationists whenever we say, according to Genesis 1 and Genesis 9, all creatures were originally herbivore or maybe omnivore, but they're only eating plants, even what are today modern carnivores. And they ridicule sinners on the teeth of the two types of creatures. Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, scoffed at Ken Ham and the Bill Nye-Ken Ham debate over that very issue a decade ago. And now they want to argue that the teeth of the herbivore Indohyus is very similar to the carnivorous teeth of whales and that they're related. Well, hey, we'd argue, you look at panda teeth, they look very carnivorous, those teeth, until you realize, you know what, they eat bamboo. Okay, so what do we get out of this? Well, one thing I think you can gather is that the evolutionary timeline is not what it's been argued to be cracked up to be. This is not a well-documented story when you look into the actual evidence on this. The evidence isn't as solid as they try to proclaim. What about famous alleged missing link fossils outside of the hominids that we'll look at in another session, like Archaeopteryx? You may have heard of Archaeopteryx. Back in 1861, the first specimen of Archaeopteryx was unearthed, and immediately this was jumped on as the premier example of a transitional fossil. This is supposed to be the creature that bridges the gap between the reptiles, namely the dinosaurs, and the birds. They believe the dinosaurs evolved into the birds. And this creature appears to have feathers, claws on its wings, and teeth. As I said, look, this is transforming into a bird. This is a dinosaur, it's transforming into a bird. Well, and then you look at the actual evidence again, we find, there's modern birds that have claws on their wings, like the African turaco and the South American hoatzin whenever it's young. Claws that they use to grasp branches and climb trees. This is not a transitional type aspect. Ostriches have claws. Also, there's a fossil of an admitted bird that was unearthed in Mongolia that had teeth. And nobody claims this to have been anything other than a bird. Other fossils of admitted birds with teeth have been uncovered as well. So notice that having claws or teeth on a bird doesn't mean it's transitioning from a dinosaur or something. These are just birds that actually have these features. Then you have the fact that a bird was discovered in Texas in sediment thought to be 75 million years older than the layer Archaeopteryx is found in, which proves that birds had already been on the scene, supposedly 75 million years before Archaeopteryx. So Archaeopteryx could hardly be a transitional form trying to turn into birds if you've already got birds around 75 million years before that. And I'm not saying that I agree with the millions of years. I'm talking about from their own perspective, the way they interpret the fossil record, that doesn't fit. Well, even though Archaeopteryx is still going to be found in most of your textbooks, young people, as an example of a missing link proving evolution, paleontologists are generally in agreement that it wasn't the missing link they thought it was. It was just a feathered bird, probably. Henry G., a British paleontologist and senior editor of Nature, said concerning the dethronement of Archaeopteryx, Archaeopteryx is just another dinosaur with feathers, is what he's arguing, that this is just a dinosaur, it's not a missing link. What about Tiktaalik, another alleged transitional fossil proclaimed to be a solid example of a transitional creature? And so this guy is said to be the transitional creature between fish and amphibians. So this is as the fish are trying to grow the necessary anatomy to be able to walk onto land. And so this creature has front fins. Its pelvic fins are thought to have been evolving into legs. Well, there's many issues with that theory to start out with, but as of 2010, the whole theory is having to be scrapped because researchers in Poland discovered not two-limbed but four-limbed animal tracks in strata, again understood to be 9 million years older than the strata that Tiktaalik was found in. And so if you've got strongly walking, four-limbed animals already in existence, already on land, millions of years before Tiktaalik, then again, this can't very well be the transitional creature between fish and four-legged animals. And yet those are the main transitional forms outside of humans that you're going to tend to see in the textbooks. What about vestigial organs? So if evolution is true and human beings are the current dominating species in this long line of evolutionary changes, starting with this ape-like ancestor, if that's true, not only would you expect the fossil record to reflect that, but you would expect at least two other things. First of all, there should be human beings alive today in transitional stages. In other words, we should be able to examine the human population and find human beings in the process of evolving into something different, something better, something more fit. We shouldn't be at like this stagnant line where nobody's changing. Maybe we're in the process of growing wings or a fifth chamber in our heart or something. And this is, of course, the main premise of the old comic book series X-Men. It was based on the idea that we should be evolving to something different. And yet we see no evidence of that happening. We don't see humans transitioning into getting wings or being able to walk through walls or gaining super healing immune systems. In fact, we see the opposite happening, right? We're deteriorating. More and more has to be done just to keep us alive as long due to disease and the accumulation of mutations in our genome. But also, if evolution were true, you should find vestiges in your body, leftovers from our supposed evolutionary ancestors. So organs that our ancestors had and used, but which we no longer need, but still have left over in our bodies and in our genomes. So evolutionists have historically admitted these sorts of vestiges should be present, and they call them vestigial organs, vestiges of our evolutionary ancestors. Back in 1895, German anatomist Robert Wiedersheim claimed to have identified 86 of these vestigial organs. And evolutionists, of course, were elated and promoted the idea that vestigial organs prove that Darwin's evolution was true. But one by one, each of these organs has been marked off the list, even though you'll still find them in textbooks. So let's look at a handful of the most often used examples very quickly. The appendix is probably the number one example that's used. It is a small pouch that hangs off the end of the large intestines, and for several years scientists didn't know what it was used for, and so they considered it to be a vestigial organ. One textbook said in humans the appendix is an example of a vestigial organ because it carries out no function in digestion. And as usual, the textbook writers either failed to get the memo or they ignored it, because now scientists know that the appendix is an important element of the immune system, especially in children. Lymphoid tissue is in the appendix, which produces white blood cells that fight disease and infection, especially when we're younger. And so the appendix is actually relatively larger in children than it is in adults. And also, recent research indicates that the appendix is involved in replenishing good beneficial bacteria after certain illnesses eliminate bacteria from the intestines. So bacteria that help to keep the bad bacteria in check are replenished by this. So the appendix is not a vestigial organ. The tonsils, once again, were thought by scientists to be vestigial, vestige of evolutionary progression. Scientists now know the tonsils help in fighting off germs. Another so-called vestigial organ, the coccyx, thought to be an undeveloped tail, like our monkey-like ancestors. However, we now know the coccyx is an important organ in human anatomy. It's the point of attachment for several pelvic muscles that helps us to stand up, to be able to stand up straight. It also serves as a shock absorber when we sit down, and so without it, we wouldn't be able to sit very well or very comfortably. The wisdom teeth have long been considered to be vestigial organs, the idea being that our supposed ape-like ancestors had bigger jaws, and so according to evolutionists, extra teeth were needed at that time, and now we don't need them, and yet there's not enough space in the jaw for them anymore, and so they tend to become impacted. They ram into other teeth. Well, and there's several problems with that idea. but I'll mention just one. Scientists have discovered that the dental crowding that causes the impaction of the wisdom teeth is actually significantly affected by our diet. Lombardi, writing in the American Journal of Orthopedics, said, dental crowding is endemic among technologically advanced populations and uncommon in primitive groups. In modern man, there's little attrition of the teeth because of a soft processed diet. This can result in dental crowding and impaction of the third molars. So Western diets cause dental crowding and the impaction of the third molars or the wisdom teeth, not evolution from some ape-like ancestor with a bigger jaw. So wisdom teeth are not vestigial organs. What about junk DNA? This evidence has been taking center stage in many circles over the last couple decades. Jerry Koine, an evolutionary geneticist at the University of Chicago, explained it this way: when a trait is no longer used or becomes reduced, the genes that make it don't instantly disappear from the genome. Evolution stops their action by inactivating them, not snipping them out of the DNA. From this, we can make a prediction, all right, scientific prediction. We expect to find, if evolution is true, in the genomes of many species, silenced or dead genes, genes that once were useful but are no longer intact or expressed. In other words, there should be vestigial genes, and he and many others believe that that's exactly what you see in the human genome: vestigial genes or pseudo genes, junk DNA, DNA that perhaps our evolutionary ancestors used but which we no longer need. But as with vestigial organs, what we're finding is that as we further examine the human genome, we find out once again they've been way too rash in trying to latch onto this as evidence for evolution. But sadly, as the evidence pours in proving that they're wrong, it's too late to undo all the damage that has been done by their false claims about this. Jonathan Wells is a molecular and cell biologist at the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle. And in his book, The Myth of Junk DNA, he cites several prominent evolutionists who use the junk DNA argument. He says the arguments by Dawkins, there's Richard Dawkins, Miller, Shermer, I've quoted from a lot of these guys already this weekend, Collins, Kitcher, Koine, and Avis rest on the premise that most non-protein coding DNA is junk without any significant biological function. Yet a virtual flood of recent evidence shows that they are mistaken. Much of the DNA they claim to be junk actually performs important functions in living cells. The following chapters cite hundreds of scientific articles that testify to those functions, and those articles are only a small sample of a large and growing body of literature on the subject. So the evidence against the junk DNA argument is growing by leaps and bounds, and as was the case with vestigial organs, the more we actually learn about the genome, the more we discover the fact that the universe has been intricately designed with specific purposes in mind for all of the features of the human body. So in truth, there are no vestiges from evolution, because as we've already seen, evolution is totally not in harmony with the evidence. It actually contradicts it on several fronts. So the alleged evidence that is said to conclusively prove Darwinian evolution is shown to be non-existent the more scientists learn about the universe. And in fact, even if there was such a thing as an organ, some feature of the human body that appears to no longer be necessary for humans to have, it still wouldn't prove evolution. Here's why. Because the creationists would argue that the existence of such organs probably indicates something about the nature of the earth in the past, as God originally created it, maybe in the pre-flood world. In other words, if there were such things as useless organs, it could be not because we evolved from some non-human creature, but it would be because humans in the past once needed those organs in maybe the pre-flood world. Keeping in mind that the pre-flood world is very different from the world in which we live today. That world is obliterated in the flood. And as the world deteriorates and decays, growing old like a garment, Hebrews 1:11, and our genomes become more and more sick, then we would expect to see some things not function the way they were originally designed to. But ultimately, after scientific knowledge has increased over time and evolutionists have discovered time and again that each of these organs on Wiedersheim's list, in fact, serve significant purposes in helping human beings, Many evolutionists have backed off of that vestigial organ argument, thankfully, because a strong argument could be made that evolution has been a hindrance to scientific progress because of its reliance on vestigial organs. So think about it. When Wiedersheim produced his list of vestigial organs, what would the effect of that have been in the scientific community? Well, anybody that believed that, the effect would have been to basically halt scientific investigation in the study of those particular organs. Why? Because they don't think we need them, right? So how much research was halted on those organs because of Wiedersheim making that argument? Like, for example, the parathyroid glands were on Wiedersheim's list. We now know that's actually an essential way that your body regulates calcium in your body. Okay, and it took everybody a long time to figure that out, no doubt, because people wouldn't have been studying the parathyroid after Wiedersheim made those kind of comments. How many people have been affected by the promotion of this idea? Vestigial organs are a myth. We know there's an important function for all of these organs and genes, even if we're not knowledgeable enough to figure out the extent of those functions. Once again, textbooks still will promote this false idea. Young people are being duped into believing evolution because of these kinds of supposed evidences. But don't miss the major implication of this brief look at vestigial organs. Remember, based on evolutionary predictions, if evolution were true, there should be vestigial organs. They themselves say that, and yet they're not there. It's as if the human body came into existence designed the way that it is, with purposes in mind for everything that we have in our body, which is, of course, exactly what the creation model says is the case. So in the end, the vestigial organ argument really has done nothing but provide more evidence that the creation model is the logical explanation for the origin of the universe. So as I've explained in previous sessions, this chart states the fundamental planks of evolutionary theory and the opposing stance that the creation model takes. And if any one of these planks can be shown to be untrue, the entire model collapses. And so we've looked at the laws of thermodynamics that show that the universe couldn't have created itself. It couldn't be self-existent. So the evidence already disproves naturalism and evolution from the get-go. The creation model is in perfect harmony with these. The Bible actually mentions these laws. We've also looked at the law of cause and effect, or the law of causality, the laws of probability, standing in the way of spontaneous generation of life. Once again, these laws support the creation model. Law of biogenesis, the rules of genetic mutation, prove that spontaneous generation, macroevolution, and neo-Darwinism are not scientific. They're irrational ideas in light of the evidence. Once again, both of these laws support the creation model. And now we're seeing that the alleged evidence in support of macroevolution, when examined a little closer, prove in fact to not be in support of the supposed evolution of man from a common ape-like ancestor, or in support of macroevolution. So geographic distribution, embryonic growth, similar physical structures, genetic similarities, vestigial organs and genes, horse and whale evolution. None of these alleged evidences of human evolution can reasonably be used as evidence for macroevolution. So these are legitimate issues that stand in the way of naturalistic evolution, problems that demand an explanation. So question, where's the evidence for naturalistic evolution? And if it's not available, then why is it even being talked about in our classrooms and so forth? Why has creation been thrown out when it actually harmonizes with the evidence? Without a reasonable, rational answer to the problems at the feet of evolutionary theories, supernaturalism is still the clear choice in harmony with the actual evidence, which again, we've been seeing that as well. Also, keeping in mind again, that's not even the point of this weekend. I've got a whole seminar just on that. I'm just showing you along the way the creation model doesn't have a problem with all this evidence. Evolution ultimately is the problem here. All right. We're done with this session. Let's go ahead and take let's do a few minute break here before we go ahead and come back with our final session of today. Let me know if you have any questions about products back there, if you need any help making